is helping out here in the background. If you have technical issues, maybe you could text her through the chat. And let's see what else. I wanted to mention sort of introduce myself. So I worked on UN and sort of global North and global South justice issues on climate change for 2 decades. And then when President Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, I decided to bring my lab group, the Climate and Development Lab, back home and work on climate obstruction. Robert Bruhl I brought him to Brown, and we co-founded the Climate Social Science Network exactly 2 years ago right now. We had our public launch in October of 2020. So I wanted to just quickly introduce you to CSSN in case you haven't seen this. A lot of it will be familiar to some people, and I apologize for that, but just it's going to take like a minute. See if I can do this right. And now I've got to find my window. I have too many windows open here. Okay, here we go. So this is our homepage. We have a lot of fresh material from scholars, really scholars around the world that are working in the area of climate change and politics. And we focus, at least as our initial topic, on climate obstruction. Who are the actors, the organizations, the strategies, the discourses, for those who would like to slow down and block climate action. This turns out to be quite an important agenda, as we have the science of climate change is irrefutable. And we have tens of thousands of studies. We have the technology, and it keeps getting cheaper and easier to install and so on. And we have policy tools to address climate change, but we are sort of stuck. And we're finally now trying to figure out the ways to get around what has been sort of understudied, underappreciated, and under-strategized. That is the groups that are obstructing action. So as our senator here in Rhode Island said, Sheldon Whitehouse, trying to understand climate change without understanding the obstruction groups is like trying to understand Star Wars without mentioning Darth Vader, which I think is quite an apt analogy, because there's just so much going on. And it's Exxon. It has historically been Exxon and the Koch brothers, but it is many, many more actors. So we have in CSSN, scholars around the world. I think we're now in 35 countries. So this is our scholar page. There's over 300 people here. We're doing things like this webinar. We have a bunch more coming up this fall, so keep tuned. We're about to announce a lot of those. We also give out grants. We've given out 2 rounds of grants to 21 teams in 33 universities in 21 countries. Let's see, what else are we doing? We have a postdoctoral fellow right now who's on the call, Jared Hearn. Jared, you want to wave? You're down there in my little tab there. Still on the front page. Glad to have you here at Brown. It's very exciting. We have working groups, and this is really where a lot of the exciting stuff is happening. You can get to it here, or you can get to it on the front page as well. So we have groups that are studying medias, discourse, power. We have a group doing a global census of climate obstruction organizations, a big project on the Atlas Network, which is all over the world. A group that's focused on the global South, a group on geoengineering, one on accountability research, so a lot of the lawsuits that are taking shape. A group on the US states, which Josh Bassiches and Becky Bromley Trujillo are the co-chairs. Josh is on this call. Then we'll be talking a little bit later. A group on greenwashing and spinning climate change on universities and special interest influence, a group on net zero. And we have emerging groups on things like the UN climate negotiations, and maybe one on agriculture industry. So we have a lot going on. I'm going to stop sharing now so we can move along. The states are an important battleground on the issue of climate change. They always have been. But for decades with Washington, D.C. just in stalemate, a lot more attention went to the states, both by those wishing to advance climate action and those wishing to stop it. So personally, I've been for now 13 years going to the state legislature here in Rhode Island, and I've learned a lot about who's there, how they manage to stop important initiatives. It's quite fascinating and super important. There's also state agencies where there's a lot of lobbying and influence going on. And then there's these things called public utility commissions, which are, semi-judicial bodies where they're usually appointed by the governor, or they're also elected. And Jared Hearn is our expert on PUCs, and might call on him later on. The Inflation Reduction Act potentially changed the whole balance here. As we study climate obstruction, it's going to be a pivot point, right? Things are changing. It's going to create a whole new set of actors who have a vested interest in keeping these subsidies and incentives that are involved. We want to make sure everybody is muted right now. If you can mute whoever's got their mic open, thank you. But do we expect that, and these are enough benefits to make some of the obstructing groups just go away? Or will they take new strategies? Will they roll out new discourses? Will they find new arenas to attempt to slow down what in some of the cases is an existential threat to their business model? And will social justice be one of the things that is used as a tool either for obstruction, or will it actually be an area where we see real improvements with the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course has rightly been criticized for some of the elements where it failed to have a lot of the environmental justice and especially participation by organizations late in the process, especially. So we have three speakers officially. Shanti Gamper Rabindran is going to start us off. She's an associate professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and the Department of Economics at the University of Pittsburgh. She's author of an exciting book called America's Energy Gamble. She's going to start. I'm going to also introduce Galen Hall, who is a graduate here at Brown University, was in my lab, did research with me, and continues to work as a researcher in the Climate and Development Lab, and is headed off to a doctoral program at the University of Michigan next fall. So we're really excited to see where he goes with this work. And then finally, we'll hear from Josh Bassages, who's the David and Jane Flowery Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Environmental Studies at Tulane University, who just finished an exciting postdoctoral time at University of Michigan. So I want to hand it over to Shanti, who hopefully can tell us some about how the federal legislation addresses environmental justice, how this will impact communities on the ground, as opposed to previous legislation. So Shanti, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. And I will pull up your PowerPoint whenever I can find it here. Are you there? Can you hear?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, great. Let me see if I can find it here. Inflation reduction and environmental justice communities. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Now let me try to full screen it. Okay.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act and how it can impact and how we can help environmental justice communities. But the key thing is the implementation. Next slide.
Okay.
So the big picture of the IRA investments into EJ communities is: one, it improves access to affordable clean energy. Two, it aims to reduce historic sources of pollution. Third, it invests to improve the quality of life of EJ communities. So the allocation can be the allocation is pretty big. It's 40 billion to 60 billion within 370 billion package. So thank you very much to the hard work of EJ communities and EJ advocates. Next slide, please. The big question here is, will the benefits reach EJ communities? And here I want to flag the work of Hannah Pearls at Harvard Environment and Energy Law Program, who's done an incredible job detailing programs, the provisions in in the IRA, and laying out the challenges in making sure EJ communities actually can participate and benefit from these provisions. So will benefits reach EJ communities? Well, it's going to depend on the program definitions for applicants and beneficiaries. Some of these are not defined precisely in the IRA. Some of them are. But the good news is we do have tools to define EJ communities. For example, the Council of Environmental Quality has a climate and economic justice screening tool. So the design and implementation of these programs are going to be important. Who can apply for the grants, for example? So we find provisions which say community-led or community-based organizations, but these are not defined precisely in the IRA. And key to implementation of any program and its reach is the capacity for organizations to apply for grants and to implement these programs. So next slide.
Okay, let me see if I can get this. All right, there we go.
Okay, so let's just look at one program and the environmental and climate justice block grants. So there's 2.8 billion for community-led pollution monitoring and reduction, mitigation of climate and health risks from extreme heat, reduction of indoor toxics, climate resilience and adaptation, facilitating the engagement of disadvantaged communities in state and federal public processes. The provision defines the applicants to be community-based nonprofit organizations or a partnership between this organization and with a tribe, local government, or higher education institution. The EPA administrator will define these disadvantaged communities. So there's one step here where the role of the EPA administrator becomes important, and therefore EJ advocates and EJ communities need to pay attention to this point. Community-led and community-based organizations are actually not defined. Next slide. So let's look at another program, financing greenhouse gas reductions and air pollution reductions. Again, we see this phenomena where the EPA administrator will define one key term, and some of the terms are left undefined. So 7 billion for appropriate greenhouse gas emission activities and zero emissions technology in low income and disadvantaged communities. So there are different beneficiaries here. 7 billion to state, municipality, and nonprofit organizations. 12 billion to those nonprofit organizations that leverage private capital. And then 8 billion for financial and technical assistance to low income and disadvantaged communities. Here, again, this low income and disadvantaged communities are not defined. The EPA administrator will define what are the appropriate greenhouse gas reduction activities. The nonprofit organization is described in the IRA. And for people who've been through the Trump administration and delved into it, the sort of leaving the EPA administrator to define the appropriate greenhouse gas reduction activities makes us a little bit worried, right? So can sort of carbon capture and storage that are still at very, very experimental stage and commercially not viable, will those take a huge chunk of the money defined for appropriate greenhouse gas reduction activities? This is just to flag to you the importance of the next step of defining these activities and therefore determining who will be the beneficiaries and whether the money will be well spent on those solutions that are already demonstrable. For example, cutting and deploying renewable energy technologies that are already proven to have to be cost effective and to also be able to model it in a way that broadens benefits to local communities, or will that money go to very experimental kind of technologies where EJ communities will be exposed to more pollution. Okay, next slide. So again, another big program is redressing the harms from transportation systems. So 1.9 billion is targeted to context-sensitive projects, and 1.3 billion is for projects in disadvantaged, underserved, or located in an area of persistent poverty. Context-sensitive here is not defined, right? So will the money go towards financing projects that will actually assist EJ communities? Next slide, please. So key in all this is the capacity of applicants and potential beneficiaries. The good news is that the IRA does include funding for technical assistance and implementation of programs that can build this capacity. So that's good news. And also in the Biden administration, federal agencies have set out equity action plans. So for example, these action plans include assisting underserved communities to learn about and navigate federal funding opportunities, providing technical assistance throughout the application process, and making federal funding applications simpler and easier to navigate. So this is good news. Next slide, please. Okay, now we come to the points where IRA provisions can burden EJ communities. So for example, in oil and gas leasing. So the quid pro quo in this in the IRA that has raised huge concerns this idea that the BLM, this provision that the BLM must offer 3 onshore oil and gas leases has a prerequisite for solar and wind development on federal lands. BOEM, which is the offshore agency, must offer 1 offshore oil and gas lease, has a prerequisite for solar and wind development on offshore federal land. On the one hand, one can say, okay, this is not such a huge big giveaway because the Mineral Leasing Act does require the offering of gas leases. And leases offered does not mean that the leases will be developed and oil and gas extraction will proceed, because one can imagine a scenario in which oil and gas just becomes non-competitive with all these funding that would enable renewable energy to take off. However, those of us who have lived through the last 4 years know that certain things can happen, and we have reason to worry. We have seen pro-oil and gas administration fast-track oil and gas leasing and rolling back regulations, including post-BP oil spill regulations. And we have seen that EJ communities have health, environmental, and economic impacts from oil and gas leasing. So there is reason for worrying here. Next slide.
Yep, 2 minutes, Shanti.
Okay, yes, I'm almost done. Another concern is this reported side deal on the fast tracking of methane pipeline infrastructure. So it was reported that Democratic leaders have agreed to advance separate legislation in September 2022 that would require relevant agencies, and I quote here, to take all necessary actions to permit the construction and operation of the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Okay, here the word here says to take all necessary actions to permit the construction, not to evaluate the pro and cons of this pipeline and then determine whether it should go ahead. So the source is Jeremy Stein's Washington Post. He actually posted these energy permitting provisions that was discussed.
Sorry about that.
But very important point here, not all Democrats agree. So there is still room to challenge this reported side deal. Next slide, please. So we can see that even within the bill, the climate bill, we do see climate obstruction provisions within the bill. We see side deals to the bill, but importantly, don't give up yet. Action is still necessary because none of these side deals are concluded. And there's more, and Galen will detail them. So take it away, Galen.
Shanti, thank you so much. I'm just going to jump in to say, if you have questions, type them in the chat. You can send them directly to Stephanie or to the whole group, but it'd be great. And I'll be handling those. So way to go, Shanti. I learned a lot. And Galen, I think you can share whenever you are ready to share, assuming you want to share.
Okay, great. And can you hear me all right?
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Let me pull these up. Cool. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Timmons. Thank you, Shanti. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So, yeah, my name is Galen Hall. I'm a researcher in the Climate and Development Lab. I focus on state-level climate and energy interest group politics. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the provisions in the IRA that affect that arena and some sort of speculative, highly speculative, I would say, predictions, or really just trends that we can all look out for in the post-IRA state legislatures. So first, I'm going to take us through some of our research on state-level climate policy coalitions, and the goal here is to understand a bit of the complexity and sort of scope of economic interests who are involved in determining climate and energy policy at the state level. Then we'll talk about the IRA a bit more, and then we'll sort of talk about what to look for after it. Okay, so our research in the CDL focuses on using lobbying and testimony disclosures from state legislatures to understand who's supporting and opposing climate and clean energy legislation across the United States. So we've done studies in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and right now we're leading a large study collecting data from 7 states with lobbying disclosures and an additional 24 with testimony disclosures, all of which tell us something about who's supporting and opposing climate and clean energy legislation. And the sort of top level finding from all this work is that state level climate politics are very complex. There are a lot of industries involved. There are varying degrees of influence by industry, varying across states and across time. Policy preferences between those industries align in some policy domains and not in others, and also change over time. And then that entire landscape can vary dramatically by state. So this figure is not really intended to, for us all to comprehend right away, but this is a sort of picture of climate and energy coalitions in Massachusetts from 2013 to 2018. So there are many different industry sectors involved, and the sort of red and green lines indicate their propensity to agree and disagree on legislative proposals. So we see that there are agreements and disagreements between different groups, sort of complex patterns at play, but major groups involved are sort of social green, environmental nonprofits, and utility companies. We also see real estate, power generation, fossil and chemical companies, automakers, hydro and wind, solar, and then conservation and planning groups. So sort of 4 top level findings from our studies so far on state level opposition and support for climate policy. What we've seen is this is largely a struggle between progressive and environmental movement organizations and some cities, and industry groups from several sectors. And then within those industry groups, typically investor-owned utilities are very influential in state policy. Josh will talk about this more, but the less tied investor-owned utilities are to fossil generation, especially through direct ownership, the more willing they are to support ambitious climate targets. They have very large lobbying budgets as well, especially compared to environmental movement organizations. It's common to see extractive industries oppose most climate legislation, and they seem to have more success in the South and Midwest, although our findings there are preliminary. And there are a lot of other industries that get involved. So real estate and construction companies in Massachusetts opposed energy efficiency mandates and gas bans. We've seen auto manufacturers and retailers typically supporting EV incentives. We've seen heavy industry and manufacturing companies typically opposing emissions mandates, and we're still trying to figure out the landscape for big agriculture companies, and it gets a little bit complicated. And the last thing to just bear in mind is this massive imbalance in resources to expend on lobbying at the state level. So this is a picture of the top 10 pro-climate advocates in Massachusetts and their lobbying budgets over the entirety of 2013 to 2018 compared to the top 10 climate opponents, just by number of bills opposed and their lobbying budgets. So we just see about a 3.5 to 1 advantage to the opponents. Okay, so I'm going to take us through some of the IRA provisions sort of categorized by the industry that they affect. I want to bear in mind here this is an incredibly complicated bill. I've done my best to distill it in a way that fits with this conversation, but there are a lot of nuances I'm going to have to skip over.
Yeah, you're gonna have to be like 3 or 4 minutes, three more minutes or something. Sorry to say.
Yep. Okay. So the IRA is best seen as a collection of carrots for various industries to make lowering emissions cheap and or profitable. It has various pots of money for state disbursement amounting to at least tens of billions of dollars. And I think the best way to see it, at least in this domain, is as an attempt to shift the incentive landscape towards clean energy, but not a comprehensive or economy-wide plan to get us to net zero. One sort of framework that can help us think about it is this emergence diffusion reconfiguration framework. I've taken this from David Victor, likes to share this graph. So the idea is that different industries are further or closer to a net zero sort of configuration. So the power sector is probably the closest. And when they're far away, then the idea for policy is to focus on promoting the emergence of new technologies that are low emission and can compete with the status quo. In the sort of middle stage, the idea is to help those technologies diffuse throughout the economy, and then finally to reconfigure the economy with a new set of standards and incentives that lock them in place. So most of our technological sectors are in the emergence phase, and then some large ones are sort of somewhere up in the diffusion phase, and then this can also vary by state. This is a lot of text that I'm not going to even read through or expect everyone to read, but the point here is that for each of the interests that I mentioned before, there's a lot of money involved that can be dispersed to incentivize the diffusion of these new lower emission technologies. So for real estate and construction, we've got lots of tax credits for heat pumps and energy efficiency targeting. For transportation, we've got EV tax credits, including for used EVs, which is nice. Production tax credits and investment tax credits to build clean energy technology within the US. Tax credits targeting utilities to adopt those sources of clean electricity and energy storage. And then we've got sort of more in the emergence phase, we've got money for research and development on clean manufacturing and industrial processes, as well as agricultural practices. Utilities like the IRA, they like these tax credits. They see them as reducing the cost for them to move ahead with clean energy technology. And there's also money for transmission capacity, which should ease the interconnection bottleneck that's holding up nearly 1,000 gigawatts of clean energy projects right now. So just very quickly, what we can look for in the post-IRA landscape. So this is a quote from Maryland State Delegate Lori Charkoudian, who recently helped pass a sort of landmark climate bill in Maryland. I think it was just signed this June, who said the IRA gives us the tools, the pieces are there, and now state policy can build on these pieces. And the idea here is that when advocates are designing state policy, they have to navigate between a lot of different interests, powerful interests who try to influence the content of major climate legislation, and utilities are probably foremost among them. And what the IRA does is provide a set of incentives that makes opposing those ambitious climate bills less sensible. So it makes it less costly for utilities to take up clean generation. It makes it less costly for home builders and real estate to implement energy efficiency practices and so forth. And that way, states that want to can pass or can try to pass more ambitious climate policy, while the industries that might typically have opposed those policies in the past now see it as actually a opportunity for profit. So the idea here is, this is just sort of my sense of the industries that are sort of whose opposition might have been neutralized by this bill versus galvanized. And in particular, I think we should watch out for coal mining and fossil power generation sort of viewing this bill as a major threat to their future profitability and rallying after it. So it ultimately trends to watch out for. Utility companies have a stronger set of incentives to adopt solar and wind, so we might see more buy-in to ambitious climate and clean energy plans from them, especially in progressive states. There's potential for growing polarization in the uptake of clean energy by state, but the siting of domestic renewables and EV manufacturing in the wake of the IRA could reconfigure political support and opposition for those industries. So if there are clean energy factories more across the South and Midwest.
1 minute, Galen.
Thanks. Interconnection and transmission are still a major bottleneck. There's, as I said, there's about 1,000 gigawatts of proposed clean energy projects that are waiting for interconnection approval. And the estimate is that 13 to 25% of them will be approved, optimistically. So going forward, there's some money for transmission in this bill, but that is something that's very tied up with state level policy and with, with NIMBYism. So for instance, I think in Maine, there's a transmission line plan to bring power down from Hydro-Quebec that's been opposed for a long time by basically NIMBY movements. So that's something to watch out for in the future. And then there's this R&D money for emergent industries that could change the landscape for steel, cement manufacturing. I should probably also add agriculture in the next decade. And that's something to watch out for, because the trend in the past has been emerging technologies grow with help from bills like the IRA, and then as they get larger and establish a foothold, then they face more opposition from incumbents who haven't invested in them. So in conclusion, the sort of overarching question is, will state legislatures pick up the stick? The IRA has provided the carrot. Will state legislatures pick up the stick? Progressive state legislatures and advocates clearly see a path open towards stricter and more ambitious climate policies. The incentives for clean generation, home building, and agricultural practices will have the most impact wherever states can remove barriers to their implementation, such as transmission deadlocks. And then fossil fuel dependent sectors will probably view post-IRA climate action as even more threatening. So personally, I'm anticipating sharper opposition to state level climate policies from those areas. Thanks, everyone.
Galen, way to go. That was awesome. And Shanti, I mean, the really nice compliment of those two talks. I've learned a lot already this morning. This is, we sort of see this as a sort of teach-in where we can call on some of the scholars in the network and help us understand at least roughly what the hell is going on right now, because things are changing so fast. So Josh, do you want to talk about some obstacles and opportunities at the state level?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Timmons, and thanks CSSN and Stephanie as well for your help. So my research focuses on investor-owned utilities, which Galen mentioned, just so people have an understanding of what these are. Basically, if you look on your electricity bill, the company, unless you live where you have a municipal utility, the company whose logos on your electricity bill, that's your investor-owned utility. There are about 150 of them throughout the country that are private utility companies that are regulated by state level public utility commissions and public service commissions. Most of them are owned by a number of large parent companies such as NextEra Energy, Duke Energy, Southern Company, Berkshire Hathaway Energy. These are big Fortune 500 companies that own multiple subsidiaries, as well as non-regulated companies throughout the world. And so I'm going to focus on what the IRA means for them and what needs to happen for its potential in the electricity sector in particular to be realized, and where things might go wrong. So first of all, and I think Galen mentioned this as well, it's noteworthy that investor-owned utilities were strongly supportive of the IRA, especially their trade association in DC, the Edison Electric Institute. This is a big contrast to Waxman-Markey, which was the last time federal climate legislation was attempted. At that point in time, utilities were split. Many of them, particularly the more progressive ones that already had strong renewable percentages of renewables in their electricity portfolios, did support Waxman-Markey, but many of them did oppose it or were silent on it. Whereas here we see almost universally with the IRA, the investor-owned utilities supporting it. So you might ask why. And in order to understand why, we have to look at the unusual business model of the investor-owned utilities. Investor-owned utilities do not, contrary to popular belief, they actually, even though wind and solar are cheaper than they've ever been relative to fossil fuels, the actual cost of the fuel is less relevant to investor-owned utilities than the return on investment that they get from ratepayers from building capital expenses. So investor-owned utilities love to build stuff. And they love to build big wind farms and solar farms, and they also love to build coal and gas plants because they get rewarded for through the way that they finance these things for doing that. And so the IRA basically, as Galen mentioned, it's an entirely carrot-based approach as opposed to a stick-based approach. So it basically creates these tax credits, which I'm going to talk about more in a moment, which really basically encourage the IOUs to build more stuff. It's just that it encourages them to build renewable stuff, but they still get to collect a return on that investment. So that's why the investor-owned utilities do like the IRA. Now, an important distinction needs to be drawn between states where the electricity sector has been to varying degrees deregulated or restructured, examples of which would include California, Texas, Massachusetts. And in these states, investor-owned utilities are not really in the generation business. They're really in the transmission and distribution business. So they basically purchase the power from independent power producers, which can, again, be coal, gas, renewables, whatever. And then the part of their business is getting that energy to the end user. And then in other states, they are vertically integrated and they own generation themselves. And traditionally, it's been the restructured utilities that have supported climate policy because they've had less at stake because they don't have coal and gas plants whose entire value they want to capture. But interestingly, with the IRA, we actually see the greatest financial opportunities for the utilities that do own generation because they can take advantage of the PTC, the production tax credit, and the ITC, the investment tax credit. Now, just to distinguish between these two tax credits, investment tax credit is traditionally associated with wind energy, whereas the production tax credit is traditionally associated with solar. Now, in order to understand the interplay between these, we need to understand how the financing works. So as the name suggests, the investment tax credit rewards companies for building new investments, for building new wind farms. The production tax credit is actually based on the output. So it's not based on the construction of the asset. It's based on how much solar energy actually is produced from the solar farm. And that's the basis of the tax credit. So utilities historically tend to prefer the production tax credit because they can finance that they can take advantage of that over a long period of time because utilities really are into long-term planning and long-term investment. So one thing that is great that the IRA does, it does a couple things that are great. One is it extends these tax credits through 2025 because they were supposed to sunset. But the even better thing is that from 2025 to 2032, it basically allows the companies to choose it's technology neutral. So instead of the production tax credit only being for wind and the investment tax credit only being for solar, they can choose whichever tax credit benefits them the most, which therefore is going to encourage wind or solar, whichever is needed the most. So this flexibility is something that the utilities really like, but it does mean that we're going to see a lot more utility-owned generation rather than these independent power producers. And this does have a strong impact when it comes to issues of economic justice, because the way electricity rates are fundamentally regressive, they hurt poor people the most. And so in sum, and I'm wrapping up here, when we go forward to look at how these things are going to play out, it's very important that we pay attention to these state level public utility commissions. In some states, they're called public service commissions. In Massachusetts, it's the Department of Public Utilities. These basically commissions are the ones whose job it is to determine how much investor-owned utilities are allowed to collect from ratepayers. And it will be very important as they try to collect as much as possible, and they use the reliability argument as a reason that they need to hang on to their fossil fuel assets. It's very important that the public is paying attention to what's going on here, and that there's consumer advocates and environmental advocates that are intervening to make sure that these decisions are actually benefiting both the environment and the ratepayer, rather than simply mechanisms for utilities to further increase their profits. So I think I'll stop there. I know this is extremely complex, but I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A.
Josh, that's really helpful, and thanks for that piece. We have a couple of questions. I want to try to weave them together if I can, and then we might want to start with Jared Hearn, who's on, who's our new CSSN postdoc here, who knows a lot about the PUC. So one is about preemption from state legislatures playing into climate obstruction at the state level. For instance, if a city wanted to act on climate using IRA funds, could limits from their state on building codes, natural gas hookups, those are called gas bans, right? Or legislation that's happened in over 20 states that prevent localities from prohibiting the hookup of gas in new construction. Has been how this has gone so far. Could that prevent them from fully harnessing those funds? And this, well, I guess we'll start with that one. Josh, why don't you go first, and then we'll pass it over to Jared and see if he has some thoughts on PUC's side of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Galen would also be equipped to speak to this. But when Galen was taking us through the interest groups that oppose climate action, one of the big ones in the building sector is the real estate industry. And absolutely, as Galen mentioned, what this bill is going to do is it's going to make gas home and building heating from gas a lot less economically competitive compared to electrification. But at the end of the day, the states are still going to have the say as to whether localities within them are allowed to pursue these bans. So absolutely, this is a prime area in which the IRA is helpful in terms of the market, but ultimately, these things will be determined at the state. And this is a great area to look for obstruction.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Do you want to jump in and introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure. Thanks, Tim.
Actually, Galen, did you want to add? I'm sorry, Jared. I just
sorry.
noticed Galen was itching to add something.
Yeah.
Just a tiny thing, like one example from Massachusetts recently is that our big climate bill that passed last year allowed municipalities to adopt stretch net zero energy codes for their buildings, but you could imagine a similar bill that forbids them from adopting those energy codes, and then the disbursement of these incentives just wouldn't work. So.
Yep. Jared, do you want to reflect a little on this?
Yeah, so this has all been great information so far. And to just build off of what Josh was saying about the role of PUCs, is they're going to be very central in this, particularly for what's already been touched on, these large scale renewable energy generation sites. PUCs are the ones approving those permits in the vast majority of states, as well as the agreements with the independent power producers for utilities. So they're going to be very active in that. And there was a question on the transmission process, and that's also PUCs, at least with intrastate transmission. Interstate is FERC, but a lot of this is intrastate transmission, and that's also under the purview of PUCs. And getting that done and being able to fight through, what is a lot of local opposition and NIMBYism, and so PUCs will be active in that. And then there's also a question on distributed generation, and that is going to be, I think, a really major conflict in PUCs because they oversee the net metering programs and other things that will incentivize people to adopt rooftop solar panels, even on top of the incentives in the IRA. And utilities are very, very opposed to them. And so I think we're going to see a big ramp up in conflict in PUCs, and it's going to be a major battle there as utilities are sort of fighting to keep these incentives lower. Renewable energy groups, consumers are going to want to see them be higher. And that's going to depend a lot on state characteristics and sort of how utility friendly the PUCs are and how much the PUCs prioritize the expanding distributed generation.
So,
Timmons, just to
yeah.
add on the distributed generation
Oh,
point.
good. Yeah. Go ahead.
Local citizens have a lot of influence in this. Okay, so distributed generation, for example, community level solar, the way we would argue for these things is to emphasize in rural communities, community solar brings income stream for farmers. And therefore, this is how we can advocate for community solar legislation in states like Pennsylvania, where the proponents for community solar are 2 Republicans. And we also have farmers who are extremely politically conservative who are advocating for distributed generation, like community solar. So I think sort of we kind of need to find where are the avenues and pressure points that move forward climate action, right? And even the point about, yes, and the point about, states are blocking local governments from having gas bans. The good thing about the IRA is that it's providing carrots, which means that it could be that heat pumps become so financially attractive that we don't actually need a ban on gas hookups because heat pumps are so attractive that real estate will actually just do heat pumps. And the issue of having bans, not having bans, no longer plays a role.
That's what we hope, right? That is the hope, and there's going to be a lot. Well, who knows? I guess I remain a little worried that it may work and it may need, there may be other things that are used to slow it down. But I appreciate the point, and we do have a question about agriculture as well. Let me see if we can figure this one out. This is from Lordana Loy. About the IRA's agricultural measures. Most of the money allocated for agriculture will pay farmers to employ what's been dubbed as climate smart farming practices. Have these practices been defined, including in the bill? Do they include agriculture's biggest climate culprit, meat and dairy production? Shanti, have you followed that, or does anybody else have any input on that one?
Well, the work that I've done with farming with actually Josh Ash, who might be on the call, it's been most farmers that we talk to in Pennsylvania and Maryland, which is rural Appalachia, they are constantly looking for strategies to increase their revenue because they need to maintain their farming.
Yeah.
And so far, what we've heard is that they are extremely interested in community solar. So that's where my focus has been. Seeing farmers as a team player in our effort to deal with climate. There are actually incentives for trying to think about how do you fund conservation so that farmers can actually make a living by pursuing conservation. So again, I think the framing of the issue needs to be correct in the sense of looking at farmers as enablers of climate action rather than as the obstruction, because they are great partners in this for action.
Yeah, I mean, as we've done these interviews around the country for the PUC and the state legislative lobbying groups study that Galen described, Nebraska has really stood out as very unusual. That is a quite conservative state that has a lot of renewable energy, especially on the wind side. And I'm wondering if Ryan Wishart could say a little bit about that and this how the farmers are weighing in on these issues right now, and including after the IRA passage.
Yeah, I mean, we are really unusual. I'm afraid I have to teach in 9 minutes, so I have to keep this brief. The classroom's right down the hall. But one of the things I've been seeing and looking at, for example, the lobbying positions of the Nebraska Power Association, which is we're all public power, so there's no private utilities in the state, but they've got in their planks support for ethanol and agriculture associated with some of that. So I think it is a complicated relationship between the power sector, which is a major source of demand for these folks, and I am very curious as to how this is going to play out in terms of response to the IRA. One thing that it's going to, I know is going to change things a bit. There've been trouble with utilities citing, like a lot of places have had, renewable energy, in part because they usually do public-private partnerships for those for the tax credits. But with the direct pay, for the first time, I think it's going to be a lot more attractive to the public utilities here to use eminent domain, which can bypass local zoning. And when they do this, it also means they don't pay any local taxes, unlike a private partnership that they've conventionally followed would. They pay, there are payments in lieu of taxes to state and county levels, but it's going to get really interesting.
Now, wait, is that just public utilities, or is that also investor-owned utilities.
We have no investor-owned utilities in the
Right.
state.
So that's the Nebraska story, and maybe other places with municipal co-ops or whatever, Thank you, Ryan, really appreciate that. We have a couple more questions. Any thoughts about the most effective means of mitigating and dealing with non-cooperative obstructionist state PUCs, public utility commissions? Josh, and then maybe Jared on that one.
I'll defer to Jared. I put my thoughts in the chat though on that.
Okay,
Legislatures, I think, is the big thing. PUCs are political agents of legislatures. They're a bureaucratic organization. Legislatures control their authorizing statutes. Some of my research shows that states that adopt RPSs, renewable energy mandates, it forces more pro-environmental issues onto PUC's agendas. So if the PUC is not playing ball, but there is sufficient mobilization to get the legislature to do something, I think they have the ability to force things onto the agenda for PUCs. And that also points to the importance of Galen's research and the others on state, of the lobbying of state legislatures, that's also another avenue that utilities can influence PUCs is through the legislature itself.
Yep.
On that point, in some states,
Great.
the PUC actually has elections, right?
Yep. Yeah, 10
So
states.
I think one of the problems we have right now is that the general public does not understand the incredible role of PUCs, right? And the elections to PUCs. And so I remember there's somebody who's standing for a PUC election in Texas, and he's more progressive. So we need these kind of people we need to vote in these people.
Absolutely. And I would just add, and I completely agree with what Shanti just said, as well as actually what Jared just said. But the other thing is that it's also, part of it is about putting the right people in the office, but part of it is about having independent advocates and people with knowledge about the incredible nuances and technicalities of the electricity sector to sort of counteract the top, whatever because right now the problem is that a lot of the PUC commissioners don't have the staff resources themselves to be able to question what the IOUs are telling them in terms of what they need in terms of cost recovery, fuel recovery. So it's both about getting the right people, but also getting the right resources and independent expertise.
Oh, to just follow up on Josh's point, Josh Bestach's point, this is really a good point. Actually, and I want to say that Pittsburgh Environmental Law Clinic is getting involved in this by starting to think about training students on understanding PUC law, which is completely opaque. And so I completely understand the need for better representation of the interests of the public and the interests of renewable energy in front of the PUCs, and law clinics have a huge role to play in this.
And I would say undergraduate training places as well. I mean, and graduate students. We have a team just starting in our lab that's going to be working with Jared and reading through all those dockets. And I find them actually more readable than this. I mean, I know it varies by different states and maybe by different parties that are, intervening in the process, but it's pretty interesting stuff to read. But I agree that people need a lot of training and we need capacity. And that's one of the big issues that I think have really risen to the top in our big research project on PUCs in New England, is that the civil society organizations just don't have the lawyers and the engineers, the consultants, and so on. And then they also, that the utilities do. And so they really need the capacity building and the support. So we're running out of time. I want to end with one last question, and I want to apologize if I've missed some of these other questions. I hope that people will ask directly to the panelists or to others. And wait, one last thing is that I thought of another issue this morning, that we should have an event like this, which is the energy crisis in Europe, so we can mobilize the CSSN network and have a session like this with people discussing, what's going on and how it matters for obstruction of climate action, what's going on in Europe with the price of energy and the shortages. But the last question was a nice one from Nora Kroger. At this point in time, how hopeful does the IRA make you, or does it make you, as a step forward towards climate action and solutions. So what order should we go in? Shanti, are you ready to give that one a swing? How hopeful does this make you?
Any little positive news, I take it and I run with it. Because I think the biggest problem we have right now is climate doomism has the next climate obstruction strategy. So in my classes, I emphasize all the strategies that's in the IRA that can bring it forward, and also the ones where we have to work very hard to make sure those provisions go in the direction we want. So any positive thing, I'm all for it.
I'm with you. Galen, you want to go next?
Sure. I mean, I think to me, not knowing a ton about, I mean, this is an incredibly complicated bill and I've done my best to educate myself on it, but it seems like very, very smart people who understand the nuances of federal and state climate policy have sort of helped craft this bill in such a way that it removes barriers as best as is politically feasible right now. So it's sort of echoing what Shanti just said, but to me, it's like this great opportunity where huge barriers have sort of been weakened, and it's sort of it's a time for advocates at the state level to push hard. And so it makes me hopeful and also makes me think that it's not a time to rest on our laurels. It's like a time for action.
Nice.
Can I just
John.
can I just get one last word on here?
You are the last word, and then we're going to wrap it up.
I agree with everything that's been said. I am an optimist, but also a political pragmatist. And the fact that this thing got done with 50 votes in the Senate after this is such a big deal. I mean, this is the first federal piece of climate legislation ever. So I think it's tremendously important. On the other hand, I think as Timon said earlier, this bill actually forces us to rely on our hopes a little more than we might like, right? Because this is going to change the economy, but we know that politics also shapes the economy, not just market forces. So this has so much potential, but it's far from certain whether its potential will be realized.
All wonderful points. And I want to just thank our panelists. Maybe we can just give everybody a virtual round of applause. Stephanie has helpfully put everybody's emails in there if people want to reach out to them or others. Keep an eye on the CSSN website and in our Twitter feed, which is just Climate SSN, at Climate SSN, for our upcoming events. We're going to be doing a lot this fall. And through the year, we'll be doing a lot of research talks by our scholars, and really excited to get the year started off. So thank you all for being awesome leaders in this discussion. I learned a lot. I have so much more to learn. And I have a lot more hope than I did just a month ago before this thing passed. It's not unbridled hope. It's very cautious and whatever, as Galen said, it means we have to work harder. So thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Special thanks to Stephanie.
Special
for running
thanks to
this.
Stephanie. Thank you for pointing that out, Shanti.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Stephanie. Take care, everybody.
Thanks all.